So picture a child's birthday party, right? Like we've all been there at some point.
Oh yeah, pizza, chaos, the whole deal.
Exactly. And inevitably, some kid is holding a bright red helium balloon on one of those thin white strings. They're running around having the time of their life, and then, for whatever reason, their little fingers slip.
Yep, and up it goes.
Right. The string slides away, the kid gasps, and the balloon just starts floating up into the sky. And everyone waves goodbye, maybe laughs a little at the drama of it all. It's just this whimsical, fleeting moment. Nobody thinks twice about it.
No, of course not. It's just a balloon.
But what if I told you that you need to completely, entirely reframe that image? Like, you aren't just watching a toy float away. You are watching an irreplaceable, finite resource. I mean, a substance that was literally manufactured over billions of years in the deep, crushing pressure of the Earth's crust, and you're just watching it leave our planet forever.
Yeah, it's wild to think about it that way.
It rises through the troposphere, breaches the stratosphere, and eventually just bleeds out into the cold vacuum of deep space. And we can never, ever get it back.
It really is a profound shift in perspective, right? To look at a cheap party balloon and realize you are staring at a genuine geological miracle that we are simply, well, throwing away.
Literally throwing it into the void.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And frankly, it's a shift we are being violently forced to make right now because that innocent little party trick, making balloons float and voices squeak, it has completely masked the reality of what this element actually is.
Which is what, exactly,
Well,
for the people listening.
It is the invisible, load-bearing pillar of the entire 21st century global economy. And over the past few months, we've been watching the foundational supports of that economy severely buckle.
Which brings us to the mission of today's deep dive. So establish the timeline with me here. For everyone listening, today is Tuesday, June 16th, 2026. And exactly 3 months ago, the global supply chain suffered a catastrophic shock. So we're going to unpack a massive stack of sources today, ranging from breaking geopolitical news in the Middle East to commodity market analysis to some truly mind-bending quantum physics lectures.
Some really heavy science in there, yeah.
Oh, for sure.
Yeah.
But our goal is to explain exactly what happened in the Persian Gulf this past March. Why this completely invisible odorless gas is the absolute only thing keeping your modern life running, and why the entire world is suddenly in this desperate scramble to find more of it before the clock runs out.
And we really need to establish the stakes right at the top because they cannot be overstated. When we talk about a global helium shortage, we are not talking about, like, Party City raising their prices.
Right. Nobody cares about the balloons.
Exactly.
Yeah.
We're talking about life-saving medical imaging machines in your local hospital going completely dark. We're talking about the manufacturing of every advanced semiconductor, every artificial intelligence chip, grinding to an absolute halt. The global space industry, quantum computing research, the backbone of cloud data centers, all of it is utterly dependent on this single finite element.
It's crazy.
The sources we're looking at today all point to a bottleneck that is entirely unprecedented in modern industrial history.
So to you, listening to this right now, we are going to give you the ultimate shortcut to understanding the invisible mechanics that keep your world functioning. We're going to connect the dots between international warfare, the bizarre behavior of atoms at the coldest temperatures in the universe, and what might genuinely be the greatest strategic policy blunder in American history.
It's a massive story.
It really is. So prepare yourself for a whole series of massive aha moments today. Let's go back to the inciting incident. Let's look at the March 2026 shockwave. Break down the timeline for me. When did the gas actually stop flowing?
Well, the timeline fractures on March 2nd, 2026, and then it just shatters completely on the nights of March 18th and 19th.
Okay.
We saw these coordinated waves of Iranian drones and missiles strike a massive industrial facility called Ras Laffan Industrial City.
Ras Laffan.
Right. Geographically, Ras Laffan is located on the northern coast of Qatar. And in the world of global energy, I mean, this place is legendary. It is the largest natural gas complex on Earth. It's just this sprawling landscape of pipelines, refineries, shipping terminals.
But they didn't just hit random pipes, right? The sources made it clear this was specific.
Extremely specific. The strikes weren't just random attacks. They specifically targeted incredibly sensitive, highly specialized infrastructure, mostly LNG trains 4 and 6, and a massive cryogenic facility known as the Pearl GTL.
Okay, just to clarify for anyone not deep in the energy sector, LNG stands for liquefied natural gas, right? And these trains aren't like actual vehicles on tracks.
Right, no, not at all.
They are these massive sequences of industrial machines that chill natural gas down so it condenses into a liquid, because that makes it dense enough to transport on ocean freighters.
That is the core mechanism, yeah. These cryogenic units take raw natural gas piped from deep underground, and they cool it to negative 162 degrees Celsius.
Which is insanely cold.
Beyond cold. And at that temperature, the methane becomes a liquid. Now, here is the crucial piece of the puzzle that most of the public completely misses. Nobody actually mines for helium directly in Qatar.
Wait, really? There are no helium wells?
Nope. There are no dedicated helium wells there at all. Helium is produced entirely as a byproduct of that natural gas liquefaction process.
Oh, I see.
Because helium has a much, much lower boiling point than natural gas. When you chill the system down to liquefy the methane, the helium remains a gas. It simply refuses to liquefy at negative 162 degrees.
Because it's stubborn.
Exactly. So at the very end of the liquefaction train, they just siphon off the remaining gas, which happens to be heavily concentrated helium.
It's like catching the exhaust from a massive freezing process. Like you're trying to freeze water, but a tiny bit of vapor refuses to freeze, so you capture it in a separate bottle.
That's a very apt way to look at it, actually. And because it is a byproduct, its production is inextricably linked to the natural gas output.
Right, so if the gas stops, the helium stops.
Automatically. When those LNG trains were damaged by the strikes and went dark, the helium production just ceased. There was no backup system, no secondary helium reservoir they could just tap into.
And Qatar is a huge player here, right?
Massive. Qatar produces roughly a third of the entire global supply of helium through this exact byproduct process. So in a matter of hours, 33% of the world's helium vanished from the market.
That is just staggering. I want to pull some specific numbers from the sources because the scale of this disruption is hard to wrap your head around. Qatar Energy's CEO confirmed that 17% of their LNG export capability was knocked out.
Yeah, that was a huge blow.
Which translates to 12.8 million tons per year of lost capacity. And those affected trains. The engineering reports suggest they're going to take 3 to 5 years to repair.
At least.
These facilities originally cost $26 billion to build, involving thousands of miles of specialized alloys and custom-built cryogenic compressors. You don't just patch that with duct tape. So Qatar lost 5% of its long-term annual supply in a single night, and effectively all of its near-term output. It's just an absolute cratering of the market.
It really is. But the physical damage to the plant is devastating, sure, but it is only the first half of the disaster.
Oh, right. The boil-off thing.
Yeah, the second half is this quirk of physics that turns a severe supply disruption into an immediate cascading catastrophe. This brings us to what the industry calls the boil-off problem.
Explain that for us.
You have to understand that liquid helium is not like crude oil or even liquefied natural gas. You can't just pump it into a giant steel tank on a dock, lock the valve, and leave it there for 6 months while you sort out your logistics.
Because to keep it liquid, it has to be kept unbelievably cold, right? Like colder than deep space. And maintaining that temperature isn't a passive activity.
Not at all. It is an active, constant battle against thermodynamics. Liquid helium sits at roughly 4 degrees above absolute zero.
Which is basically
Zero, practically, yeah. So even inside the most advanced multi-million-dollar vacuum-insulated cryogenic shipping containers, they usually call them ISO containers, heat slowly, inevitably leaks in.
Because heat always wants to get in.
It's a thermodynamic inevitability. Heat will always seek out the cold. And as that microscopic amount of thermal energy enters the container, the liquid helium reacts immediately. It begins to boil and expand back into a gas.
And gas takes up way more space than liquid.
Exactly. So if you were to seal the container completely shut to prevent any gas from escaping, the pressure would build exponentially until the entire steel tank exploded like a massive bomb.
Oh, wow. So they have to let some out.
Right. Engineers design these containers with specialized pressure relief valves. As the liquid helium boils into gas, the valve automatically opens and vents it out into the atmosphere to keep the internal pressure stable and safe.
So it's a resource that actively disappears while it's just sitting there. You are racing against a melting ice cube, except the ice cube is worth millions of dollars.
A typical specialized container will completely boil off its contents in roughly 40 to 48 days.
Jeez, that's a tight window.
Very tight. Now, picture the scene in the Persian Gulf in March 2026. When the strikes hit, the geopolitical fallout caused the Strait of Hormuz to effectively closed to commercial shipping.
Right. Nobody wanted to sail through a war zone.
Exactly. Insurance rates skyrocketed, and hundreds of these massive, incredibly expensive cryogenic containers were stranded on docks in Ras Laffan and on cargo ships anchored in the Gulf. They couldn't move.
Oh, no.
And as they sat there, baking under the intense Middle Eastern sun, the internal temperature of those tanks slowly ticked up. The pressure relief valves did exactly what they were designed to do to prevent an explosion. They opened.
And it all just drifted away.
Millions upon millions of dollars of liquid helium simply hissed out into the air, rising straight to the top of the atmosphere and drifting off into space. It evaporated into nothing.
That is just a haunting image. Watching your most precious, technologically vital resource literally evaporate into the sky because the cargo ship can't leave the port.
It's a nightmare for the supply chain.
Naturally, the global markets panicked. The industry analysis we reviewed quotes Phil Kornbluth, who is this veteran with 42 years of experience in the helium market, and he noted that spot prices jumped 70 to 100% within a single week of the strikes.
Doubled overnight, basically.
Yeah. We've got major chip fabrication plants in Taiwan and South Korea drawing down their existing inventory much faster than new shipments can possibly arrive. But let's look at the timeline of the fallout for a second. If an oil refinery blows up, we see the impact at the local gas station almost immediately, right? Gas prices spike overnight.
Sure.
But the physical shortage of helium took weeks to actually hit the end consumers, like the hospitals running MRI machines. What accounts for that delay? Okay, let's unpack this. Why did it take so long?
That delay speaks to the incredibly hidden, complex nature of specialized industrial supply chains. The commodity spot market, the financial traders buying and selling paper contracts, they reacted instantly because they trade on the news and the anticipated scarcity.
Right, the finance guys move fast.
But the physical molecules of helium have a very long, highly specialized, and deeply opaque journey from the desert of Qatar to a hospital in Chicago.
When you say opaque, you mean the logistics aren't just a straight line from producer to consumer, like Amazon Prime for gas.
Far from it. When Qatar produces the helium, it gets loaded into those cryogenic ISO containers we mentioned. Those containers are loaded onto massive ocean freighters, which travel for weeks to major redistribution hubs in Europe, Asia, or North America.
Okay.
Once they arrive, the bulk liquid is transferred to smaller, localized distributors. Those distributors then partition it into smaller dewars, which are basically specialized vacuum flasks, and eventually truck it to individual hospitals, university laboratories, or semiconductor plants.
So there are a lot of middlemen.
Tons. When the tap was turned off in Qatar in March, all the helium that was already on the ships mid-ocean or already sitting at the regional hubs kept flowing to the end users.
Yeah.
It created this dangerous false sense of security.
Oh, I see.
A hospital administrator in Ohio was still receiving their scheduled deliveries in late March and early April because they were receiving the physical helium that was extracted from the ground back in January and February.
It's a pipeline effect. Like the water is still coming out of your kitchen faucet because the miles of plumbing between your house and the reservoir are full, even though the reservoir itself just completely dried up. You don't know you're out of water until the pipe goes hollow.
The pipeline analogy is perfect.
Yeah.
But once that global pipeline empties out, the physical rationing hits the market, and it hits brutally. You suddenly have a massive, unfillable deficit. And the secondary suppliers have to start making agonizing phone calls to their clients.
Telling them they're cut off.
Yeah. They have to inform hospital networks and multi-billion-dollar tech companies that they're only getting 50% of their usual allocation. Or, in the case of smaller research labs, nothing at all.
This raises a fundamental question that I know a lot of people are shouting at their speakers right now. If helium is this incredibly fragile to transport, if the supply chain is this precarious, and if it's literally evaporating on the docks, why don't we just use something else?
That's the logical question.
Right. I mean, human engineering is defined by our ability to find substitutes. If we run out of copper, we use aluminum. If we run out of natural rubber, we synthesize it from petroleum. Why can't we just use hydrogen or nitrogen or invent a synthetic chemical alternative for these machines? What makes helium so uniquely irreplaceable?
To answer that, we have to transition away from geopolitics and industrial logistics and dive straight into the quantum mechanics of the atom itself.
Oh boy, here we go.
Because the reason helium cannot be substituted is not an economic choice. It is dictated by a rigid quirk of physics that no other element in the observable universe shares. Helium isn't valuable simply because it's rare on Earth. It's valuable because of its fundamental, inherent atomic structure.
Let's strip the helium atom down to its core then. It's the second lightest element in existence, right behind hydrogen. It's an extraordinarily small atom, and chemically, it belongs to a group known as the noble gases.
Correct.
Now, in high school chemistry, they usually compare elements to people at a dinner party with oxygen mingling with everyone. But I think a better way to visualize helium in an industrial context is to imagine a perfectly smooth, solid Teflon ball bearing inside a complex machine.
I like that analogy.
Right, because every other element is like a gear with teeth. They want to lock together, they want to form chemical bonds, rust, burn, or react. But the helium atom has no teeth, it is perfectly smooth, it rolls right through the machine without catching onto a single gear.
That is a highly accurate mechanical visualization. The chemistry term for that smoothness is being entirely inert. A standard helium atom consists of 2 protons and 2 neutrons in its nucleus, surrounded by a single complete shell of 2 electrons.
And that's all it needs.
Exactly. Because that outer electron shell is perfectly full and balanced, the atom has absolutely no electrical desire to share or swap electrons with other atoms. It simply refuses to form chemical bonds.
So it won't mix with anything.
It doesn't combine with oxygen to ignite, which is why it's not flammable like hydrogen. It doesn't react with the rocks or the soil underground. It just exists, completely isolated and self-contained.
The ultimate loner.
And because it doesn't stick to other atoms, because the attractive forces between 2 helium atoms are so unbelievably weak, it is incredibly difficult to force a collection of them to condense into a liquid, and it's nearly impossible to force them to lock together into a solid.
Which brings us to the absolute zero problem, which is where the physics of this element cross over into something almost mystical. Absolute zero is 0 Kelvin, which translates to negative 273.15 degrees Celsius.
The absolute bottom of the thermometer.
Right. It is the theoretical lowest temperature physically possible in the universe. It is the point where the thermal energy of a system is entirely depleted, and all thermal motion of atoms comes to a complete standstill. Now, according to the physical properties detailed in our sources, every other gas freezes solid long before you get to that absolute bottom.
Way before.
Hydrogen, the only atom lighter than helium, freezes solid at 14 Kelvin. Neon freezes at 24 Kelvin. The nitrogen and oxygen in the air we breathe turn into solid blocks of ice way up between 50 and 80 Kelvin.
Right.
But helium is the solitary exception in the cosmos. It is the only known substance that remains a liquid all the way down to absolute zero at normal atmospheric pressure.
And the mechanism behind this defiance of freezing is a phenomenon physicists call zero-point motion.
Zero-point motion.
Yeah, it's a fundamental principle of quantum mechanics derived from the Heisenberg uncertainty principle. Even as you approach absolute zero, when you drain almost all the thermal heat energy out of the system, the helium atoms don't just stop and lock into a rigid crystal lattice like water turning into ice.
Just deep moving.
Yes. Because the helium atoms are so incredibly light, and because their atomic attraction to each other is so incredibly weak, remember your smooth Teflon bearings, they retain an inherent quantum jitter.
The way I picture this quantum jitter is like trying to force a massive crowd in a mosh pit to sit down on the floor and hold hands. You can turn down the music, you can drop the temperature in the room until everyone is freezing cold, but the individuals in the crowd are vibrating with so much inherent frantic energy that they simply refuse to lock arms into a rigid geometric formation. They just keep sloshing and bumping around each other.
The zero-point motion entirely overcomes the weak attractive forces trying to bind the atoms together. So at normal atmospheric pressure, helium will simply never form a solid no matter how much heat you remove.
It just refuses.
It absolutely refuses to freeze unless you subject it to roughly 25 atmospheres of crushing pressure to physically force the atoms together against their quantum will.
Wow.
This single, unyielding physical fact is exactly why helium has absolutely no substitute in cryogenic engineering. If you are building a technology that requires a working temperature colder than 14 Kelvin, which, as we'll explore shortly, modern human civilization desperately relies upon, helium is literally your only option in the entire universe.
So you can't just cook up a replacement in a lab.
There is no synthetic alternative.
Yeah.
You cannot engineer a substitute for the fundamental laws of quantum mechanics.
But the weirdness of helium doesn't stop at just being incredibly cold. Because if you take liquid helium and cool it down just a little bit further, past its standard boiling point of 4.2 Kelvin, it crosses a specific thermal threshold called the lambda transition at 2.17 Kelvin.
This is where it gets really fun.
And this is where the physics just shatter common sense. The expert sources we pulled, specifically referencing the Nobel Prize-winning work of Richard Feynman, describe this transition as turning the liquid helium into a superfluid.
The discovery and explanation of superfluidity remain one of the most beautiful and bizarre chapters in 20th century physics.
Tell me about it.
When you cool liquid helium below that 2.17 Kelvin mark, a large fraction of the helium atoms suddenly drop into the exact same ground quantum state. Because standard helium-4 atoms are classified as bosons, the rules of quantum mechanics allow them to occupy the exact same state simultaneously.
They basically sync up.
They stop acting like individual, bouncing atoms bumping into one another, and they start behaving collectively, coherently, as a single macroscopic quantum object. It forms what is known as a Bose-Einstein condensate.
And the way this condensate behaves in the physical world sounds like literal magic. The physics papers note that a superfluid has zero viscosity. Not low viscosity, not kind of slippery, zero viscosity.
It means the fluid flows with absolutely no internal friction whatsoever. If you set an open cup of superfluid helium on a laboratory table, the liquid will literally defy gravity.
Wait, how?
It will creep up the inner walls of the cup, flow over the rim, and drip down the outside to pool on the table.
That is insane.
Because it has no friction, it flows through microscopic cracks and pores in glass or metal that no other liquid or gas could ever penetrate. Furthermore, its thermal conductivity becomes effectively infinite.
Meaning it transfers heat perfectly?
It conducts heat millions of times more efficiently than the highest-grade copper wire. If you apply a localized heat source to a bath of superfluid helium, it doesn't boil and create bubbles like a pot of boiling water. The heat transfers so perfectly and instantaneously through the entire fluid that a smooth, elegant jet of liquid a fountain will just shoot straight upward without a single bubble forming.
And my absolute favorite part of the literature, it refuses to rotate. If you put a pool of superfluid helium in a bucket and physically spin the bucket on a turntable, the liquid inside just sits perfectly still while the container spins around it.
Yep, it completely ignores the friction of the walls because there is no friction to transfer the momentum.
It is a macroscopic, visible display of quantum mechanics happening right in front of your eyes. Now, while that sounds like an incredibly fun parlor trick for a physics professor, this exact bizarre behavior is the invisible foundation that allows the most advanced multi-million-dollar machines on our planet to function without melting themselves down.
Which brings us to the real-world applications. Because all of these bizarre quantum properties we just discussed, the unmatched universe-leading cold, the zero viscosity, the infinite thermal conductivity, these are not just scientific curiosities confined to a textbook.
No, they're everywhere.
They are the actual structural steel of modern.
Let's go through the priority list of what physically breaks when the helium runs out. Let's start with the big one, the application that impacts everyday people the most directly and urgently. Medical MRIs.
Right, the healthcare sector.
The industry data indicates that roughly 25% of all the helium we produce globally goes straight into magnetic resonance imaging machines. There are roughly 12,000 of these machines operating in the United States alone.
And every single one of those standard MRI machines requires an initial fill of around 2,000 liters of liquid helium just to operate.
2,000 liters, just to start it up.
Yes. We need to look at how an MRI functions to understand why. An MRI doesn't use harmful radiation like an X-ray. It works by generating an incredibly powerful magnetic field, usually around 1.5 to 3 Tesla.
Which is incredibly strong.
Very strong. That magnetic field aligns the protons in the water molecules inside your body, and radio waves are used to map those protons to create a perfect, non-invasive image of your internal organs.
It's amazing technology.
But to generate a magnetic field that intensely powerful, without the machine's wiring instantly melting itself into a puddle of slag due to electrical resistance, you have to use superconducting wire.
Ah, superconductors.
The industry standard is an alloy of niobium and titanium. Superconductors are materials that conduct massive amounts of electricity with absolutely zero resistance, but they only exhibit this property if they are kept below their critical temperature. For niobium titanium, that means keeping the entire massive magnet bathed in a continuous pool of liquid helium at 4.2 Kelvin.
The margins of error are terrifying. If that magnet warms up even a few degrees, if the helium boils off and isn't replaced, the niobium titanium loses its superconductivity.
And then things get bad.
The electrical resistance returns in an instant. Suddenly, the massive electrical current running through the wires encounters friction, which generates an immense wave of heat, and the magnet effectively self-destructs in a violent process called a quench.
It's as scary as it sounds.
The remaining liquid helium instantly flash boils into gas and vents out of the roof of the hospital. Without a steady, reliable supply of liquid helium, every MRI machine on the planet eventually quenches and dies. There goes our ability to safely detect brain tumors, map spinal cord injuries, and catch early-stage cancers.
The dependency is just as absolute, if not more complex, in the technology sector. Take semiconductors, the physical foundation of the entire digital age.
Right, the chips.
The most advanced microchips in the world, the ones powering your smartphone, the ones driving the massive server farms for artificial intelligence, the ones running advanced military targeting systems are manufactured using machines built by a single Dutch company called ASML.
ASML, right, they have a monopoly on this.
They do. These are extreme ultraviolet or EUV lithography machines. They are arguably the most complex machines ever built by human hands, costing upwards of $200 million for a single unit.
Let's break down the mechanics here. How exactly does a gas that refuses to freeze fit into the process of printing a computer chip?
EUV lithography works by projecting light with a wavelength of exactly 13.5 nanometers onto a silicon wafer. This light is used to carve out billions of microscopic transistors that are mere atoms wide.
Okay, 13.5 nanometers. Got it.
To generate that specific 13.5 nanometer light, the machine fires a high-powered laser at microscopic droplets of molten tin, turning the tin into a glowing plasma.
Sounds like sci-fi.
It really does. The problem is that light at a wavelength of 13.5 nanometers is highly energetic and is immediately absorbed by almost everything. If you try to shine EUV light through regular air, the oxygen and nitrogen molecules absorb the light before it travels even a millimeter toward the silicon.
So they have to do it in a vacuum.
Exactly. The entire process has to happen inside a high vacuum. However, even in a vacuum, you have trace contaminants, and the plasma creation generates microscopic debris. You need a buffer gas to protect the incredibly delicate, flawless mirrors that bounce the light around.
Let me guess. Helium.
Helium is the only gas in existence that is light and transparent enough to let that extreme ultraviolet light pass through without absorbing it or distorting the beam, while simultaneously providing enough thermal conductivity to cool the optics and sweep away the tin debris.
So without it, the mirrors just get ruined.
Without a constant flow of highly purified helium, the EUV mirrors degrade, the light gets absorbed, and the entire cutting-edge semiconductor industry comes to a complete standstill. You literally cannot build a modern AI chip without it.
It's just wild to conceptualize. The ultra-fast processor in your phone, the algorithms predicting the weather, all of it only exists because of an unreactive, smooth little atom buffering a laser inside a vacuum chamber.
It's all connected.
But it's not just the chips themselves, it's the infrastructure where the data lives.
Yeah.
Cloud servers. I was completely blindsided by this detail in our research. Data centers run massive arrays of hard drives, and increasingly, those physical hard drives are completely hermetically sealed and filled with helium instead of regular air.
The physics behind that are actually very elegant. Helium is exactly 1/7 the density of the air we breathe.
Which means less air resistance.
Precisely. Inside a high-capacity hard drive, you have multiple magnetic platters spinning at thousands of revolutions per minute. When they spin in normal air, the density of the oxygen and nitrogen creates significant friction, heat, and aerodynamic turbulence.
So they pump out the air and put helium in.
By pumping the air out and replacing it with helium, the internal density drops so dramatically that the aerodynamic friction plummets. This allows hardware companies like Western Digital to stack 7, 8, or 9 platters in the exact same physical space that used to hold only 5.
More platters, more data.
Exactly. The drives run 20% cooler, they require significantly less electricity to keep spinning, and they hold vastly more data. The entire modern architecture of cloud computing, streaming video, and global data storage is physically floating on helium.
And speaking of floating, let's look up at the sky. Aerospace and fundamental scientific research. SpaceX alone launched over 160 Falcon 9 rockets in the past few years. You'd think a rocket is just a metal tube filled with explosive fuel, right?
That's the popular conception.
But they desperately need helium to pressurize those fuel tanks. When a Falcon 9 is pumping massive volumes of liquid oxygen and liquid hydrogen out of the main tanks and into the combustion chamber of the engines, the fuel leaves behind empty space.
And you can't just leave a vacuum inside a rocket tank.
No. You have to immediately backfill that empty space with a high-pressure gas to maintain the structural integrity of the tank at around 5,500 psi. If you don't, the tank will literally crumple in on itself like an empty soda can under the pressure of the atmosphere and the forces of acceleration.
Just crushed like a tin can.
And what gas can you pump into a tank sitting directly next to liquid hydrogen, which sits at a freezing 20 Kelvin without that gas turning into solid ice and clogging the valves?
Only helium.
Exactly. Only helium.
And the reliance on fundamental scientific exploration is even more extreme. The James Webb Space Telescope, which is fundamentally altering our understanding of the universe, uses a closed-cycle helium cryocooler to keep its mid-infrared instrument chilled to just 6 Kelvin, operating 1,000,000 miles away from Earth.
Wow. And down here on Earth?
Closer to home, you have the Large Hadron Collider, the 27-kilometer circular particle accelerator spanning the border of France and Switzerland. That's where scientists discovered the Higgs boson.
Right, the God particle.
Yes. They use 120 metric tons of liquid helium. They use it to cool their thousands of superconducting dipole magnets down to 1.9 Kelvin.
Wait, 1.9, that's below the lambda point.
Exactly. They're literally operating below the lambda transition. They use helium as a superfluid to achieve the necessary flawless thermal conductivity to keep the accelerator running.
Okay, here's where it gets really interesting. If helium is this structurally critical across all these incredibly diverse, incredibly vital sectors, how does the market decide who gets it when the well runs dry? When the supply out of Qatar gets cut by a third instantly, who is the first to get cut off?
The rationing process during a shortage is brutal, opaque, and primarily driven by a ruthless combination of price tolerance and critical necessity.
So survival of the richest.
In a way, yes. Medical MRIs generally sit at the absolute top of the allocation hierarchy. Industrial suppliers ethically recognize that human lives are immediately on the line, so major hospital networks might still receive 100% of their required allocation.
Even though the supply is down.
Yes, though they will be forced to pay astronomically higher prices for it, which eventually trickles down to healthcare costs for the patient. Semiconductor fabs are next in line. Companies like TSMC and Intel have incredibly deep pockets, and their factories simply cannot physically operate without the gas, so they will absorb the 100% price hikes on the spot market and buy whatever supply exists.
Which means the people at the bottom of the list, the ones who don't have billions of dollars in revenue or immediate life or death leverage, are the ones who get completely frozen out.
Exactly. Fundamental scientific research takes the hardest, most devastating hit. University physics departments, quantum computing researchers, fiber optic cable manufacturers, they operate on tight academic grants or fixed industrial budgets.
They can't just absorb a 100% price hike.
They can't. When a shortage of this magnitude hits, their allocations get slashed, or they simply get priced out of the market entirely. We have seen periods during past milder shortages where major universities had to literally pull the plug and shut down multi-million-dollar, years-long experiments simply because they couldn't afford to buy the liquid helium required to keep their superconducting magnets cold.
Years of human knowledge gathering just gone because the gas got too expensive.
It's tragic, but it's the reality of the market.
We've established that this substance is effectively industrial magic, and it is the hidden scaffolding holding up our entire technological civilization. Which makes the next question painfully obvious, almost infuriatingly so. If it's this important, why can't we just make more of it?
That's what everyone asks.
I mean, we live in an era where we can split the atom, we can synthesize impossibly complex pharmaceuticals in a lab, we can grow meat in a petri dish. Why can't we just build a helium factory?
Because the manufacturing process for helium requires energetic thresholds and geological timeframes that make human industry look like a fleeting joke. To understand why we can't just build a factory, we have to look at the origins of the element itself. The story of Earth's helium constitutes a massive, cruel cosmic irony.
Right, because if you look at the universe as a whole, helium is everywhere. Most helium in the universe was forged in the extreme heat of the Big Bang. Roughly 24% of all visible matter in the entire cosmos is helium. It's the second most abundant element.
It's incredibly common.
It's burning in the sun. It makes up a massive percentage of gas giants like Jupiter. It's swirling in vast interstellar nebulas.
That is the irony. It is incredibly abundant in the universe, but practically none of that primordial helium helps us here on Earth.
Why not?
The helium forged in the Big Bang is permanently trapped in massive gravitational wells. The sun has immense gravity. It holds onto its helium easily. Jupiter holds onto its helium. But the Earth is a small, warm, rocky planet.
Not enough gravity.
Exactly. When the Earth was actively forming 4.5 billion years ago, any primordial helium that was trapped in the coalescing dust was quickly lost to space. The Earth's gravity simply wasn't strong enough to hold on to a gas that is so incredibly light and thermodynamically energetic.
It just floated away.
Therefore, the helium we actually use today, every single atom sloshing inside an MRI machine or keeping a semiconductor clean, was not here when the Earth was born. It had to be manufactured much, much later.
Manufactured deep underground. And the source material for this manufacturing process is highly radioactive. This is the part of the research that completely blew my mind. The helium we rely on comes from the incredibly slow radioactive decay of heavy, unstable elements like uranium and thorium sitting deep in the Earth's crust.
Yes. Deep beneath our feet, locked inside ancient formations of granite and basalt, you have deposits of unstable isotopes like uranium-238. These massive atoms have been sitting in the dark for billions of years.
Just waiting.
And occasionally, entirely randomly governed by the laws of quantum probability, one of these unstable uranium nuclei will undergo a process known as alpha decay. To make itself slightly more stable, the nucleus violently ejects a tiny bundle of subatomic particles. That bundle, called an alpha particle, consists of exactly 2 protons and 2 neutrons.
Which is the exact recipe for a helium nucleus.
Precisely. It shoots out of the decaying uranium atom at roughly 5% of the speed of light, plowing through the dense surrounding rock.
Like a microscopic bullet.
As it smashes through the crystal structures, it rapidly loses its kinetic energy and eventually comes to a dead stop. Within microseconds of stopping, its positive charge attracts and strips 2 electrons away from the neighboring atoms in the rock. The moment it captures those 2 electrons, it becomes a completely neutral, fully formed atom of helium.
It's just fascinating.
It is the exact same element burning in the heart of the sun, but born in the pitch black under crushing geological pressure.
But the production rate is agonizingly, painfully slow. Think about how slowly uranium decays. The entire Earth, factoring in all the radioactive decay happening in the crust globally, only produces about 3,000 metric tons of helium a year.
Which is nothing on an industrial scale.
It's not a river of gas. It's a geological drip, a microscopic trickle spanning millions and millions of years. And the compounding factor is, once the atom is created, it doesn't just sit peacefully in the rock. It desperately wants to escape.
This phenomenon is known as the Great Escape, and it is governed by the Maxwell-Boltzmann distribution of gases. In any collection of gas at a specific temperature, the atoms are not all moving at the same speed.
Right, there's a bell curve.
The temperature you measure just tells you the average kinetic energy of the entire group. Because a helium atom is so incredibly light, an atomic mass of 4, compared to the nitrogen in our atmosphere at 28 or oxygen at 32, it takes very little thermal energy to make it move incredibly fast.
So it's zipping around?
At standard room temperature, the average helium atom is zipping around roughly 3 times faster than a nitrogen molecule.
So they naturally migrate. They slip through the microscopic pores of the crust, rising up through the dirt, diffusing into the troposphere and the stratosphere, migrating higher and higher until they hit the very edge of the Earth's atmosphere, the exosphere.
And up in the exosphere, the physics turn violently against us. The atmosphere is incredibly thin up there, and the gas is constantly getting blasted by intense, unfiltered ultraviolet radiation and solar wind from the sun.
Getting heated up even more.
The atoms get heated up, and their kinetic energy spikes massively. Because helium is so light, the fastest moving atoms in that statistical distribution, the speedsters on the far right of the bell curve, actually reach speeds exceeding 11 kilometers per second.
11 kilometers per second. For anyone doing the orbital mechanics math, that is the literal escape velocity of planet Earth.
Exactly. Once a helium atom hits that critical speed, it breaks free of Earth's gravitational pull entirely. It enters a hyperbolic trajectory out into the cold void of the solar system and never returns.
Oh.
Additionally, a large portion of helium becomes ionized in the upper atmosphere, gets caught in the open magnetic field lines near the Earth's poles, and gets forcefully funneled out into space by the polar wind. Between these escape mechanisms, the Earth constantly bleeds roughly 50 grams of helium into the void every single second of every single day.
Let me summarize this absurdity for a second. We have a critical technological resource that is created one single atom at a time by decaying radioactive rocks, and the moment it is born, it begins a relentless upward journey, specifically to launch itself into deep space.
It really doesn't want to be here.
The fact that we have any helium at all to put in an MRI machine seems less like an industrial supply chain and more like a geological miracle.
It is entirely a geological miracle. The only reason we have any concentrated supply to tap into is that over the course of hundreds of millions of years, some of that rising, escaping helium happens to encounter a completely impermeable layer of rock, a cap rock, typically a massive underground dome of dense salt or unbroken shale.
It hits a ceiling.
This cap acts as an impenetrable underground ceiling. The helium gets trapped in the porous rock below the ceiling, usually alongside much larger, rising deposits of natural gas like methane. It just sits there, trapped in a high-pressure geological time capsule, slowly accumulating atom by atom for 200, 300, 400 million years.
Which circles us all the way back to why we extract it in places like Ras Laffan in Qatar. We drill deep into the crust, looking for the massive deposits of methane to power our electrical grids, and we stumble upon the trapped helium as a lucky bonus.
Exactly.
But just to completely nail shut the door on the factory idea, we truly can't replicate this. We can't just build a machine that forcefully smashes atoms together and makes it.
Looking purely at the physics and the energetic bottlenecks, the answer is effectively no. You have two theoretical paths to synthesize helium. You could fuse hydrogen isotopes together, which is exactly what the sun does.
But we haven't mastered fusion yet.
Right. Human fusion reactors are still largely experimental. They aren't producing reliable net positive energy for the power grid, let alone producing commercial, harvestable quantities of helium as a byproduct.
What's the other path?
The other theoretical path is using a massive particle accelerator to aggressively bombard a target material, like lithium, with protons to physically knock helium nuclei loose.
But the energy required to run a particle accelerator just to get a microscopic amount of gas. That sounds ridiculously expensive.
It is economically absurd. The electricity cost to run a particle accelerator long enough to produce even a macroscopic droplet of liquid helium would run into the billions of dollars.
Okay, so that's a no.
It is completely unviable for any industrial scale. We cannot synthesize it. We are entirely fundamentally dependent on finding the rare geological traps that nature spent hundreds of millions of years patiently filling up. Our entire high-tech civilization is living completely off of geological interest.
We've established the stakes. Helium is structurally load-bearing for modern medicine and technology. It is profoundly difficult to find, energetically impossible to manufacture, and actively scopes into space the moment you let it go. Given all of those terrifying facts, any rational person would assume that the United States government would treat this gas with the utmost reverence. You would assume we treat it like weapons-grade plutonium, right? We'd have it locked down in massive strategic reserves, guarded by the military, shielded from market shocks.
That would make sense.
And the crazy thing is, we did. For decades, we did exactly that, and then we sold it.
Oh, we did.
Let's talk about the ultimate strategic blunder, America's helium garage sale.
The history here is fascinating, deeply complex, and full of sharp policy pivots that look baffling in hindsight. The U.S. government actually recognized the immense strategic value of helium over a century ago.
Way back after World War I.
Following the conclusion of World War I, the military establishment firmly believed that the future of naval reconnaissance, border patrol, and strategic bombing lay in massive, lighter-than-air ships, zeppelins.
Blimps.
Now, to make a zeppelin float, you can fill it with hydrogen, which provides excellent lift and is very cheap to produce chemically. But hydrogen is explosively, violently flammable.
Right. The Hindenburg disaster in 1937 being the most famous, tragic example burned into the public consciousness of why putting a spark near a giant bag of hydrogen is a terrible idea.
Exactly. The American military realized early on that helium provided almost as much lifting power as hydrogen. But as we discussed with the Teflon ball-bearing analogy, it is completely inert. It absolutely does not burn.
So it was a tactical advantage.
If your military airship takes enemy anti-aircraft fire and the hull is breached, it might leak gas and slowly descend, but it will not explode into a catastrophic fireball. Recognizing this immense tactical military advantage, the U.S. Congress passed the Helium Act in 1925 and heavily amended it in 1927 and 1929, effectively locking down all of America's helium under strict federal control.
I courted it.
They outright banned its export to other nations.
They created the Federal Helium Reserve. And to store it, they found a unique geological formation in the Texas Panhandle near Amarillo called the Bush Dome. It was a naturally sealed, massive underground reservoir where they could take the extracted helium, pump it back into the Earth, and store it long-term without it escaping into the atmosphere.
For the vast majority of the 20th century, the cliffside field situated over the Bush Dome was the only working national stockpile of an industrial gas anywhere on the planet. The government aggressively bought up crude helium, extracted from various natural gas wells across the Great Plains, and relentlessly pumped it down into the dome.
And they built up a huge supply.
By 1995, the reserve was a staggering, unprecedented success in terms of sheer volume. It held roughly 32 billion cubic feet of helium deep underground. To put that into perspective, that was enough gas to supply the entire global demand for a full decade, even if every other plant on Earth shut down.
But there was a massive fiscal catch. Because the government had been aggressively buying all this helium from private drillers for decades to build the stockpile, they had racked up a massive ledger debt doing it.
It wasn't cheap.
The historical sources note the reserve had accumulated about $1.4 billion in debt by 1995. And this is where the story takes a massive, historically consequential left turn. In 1996, Congress passed the Helium Privatization Act.
The driving logic of the 1996 Act was heavily rooted in post-Cold War fiscal policy. The era of the Zeppelins was long gone, the immediate military necessity for blimps seemed to have entirely faded, and Congress looked at the $1.4 billion debt on a spreadsheet and decided the federal government simply needed to get out of the helium storage business entirely.
So they decided to liquidate it.
The act mandated the complete, systematic sell-off of the strategic reserve.
But the truly devastating part of this legislation wasn't just that they decided to sell a strategic asset, it was the specific mechanism of how they priced it for the market.
That is the crux of the market distortion. The legislation instructed the administrators of the reserve to sell off the helium at a rigid, formulaic price specifically designed to simply pay down that $1.4 billion debt by a target date.
So they ignored the real value.
Completely. The mandated price was totally untethered from the gas's actual global market value, its geological scarcity, or its rapidly growing strategic importance to emerging 1990s technologies like early MRI machines and semiconductor manufacturing.
They essentially slapped a permanent clearance sales sticker on an irreplaceable asset. Think about what that does to a global market. If the biggest supplier in the world, holding a decade's worth of supply, is aggressively dumping billions of cubic feet of helium onto the market at artificially depressed prices, it completely destroys the financial incentive for anyone else to produce it.
The distortion was catastrophic for long-term supply. The National Academies of Sciences later reviewed the policy and concluded that this rigid formula sold America's helium far below its true market value for 2 solid decades.
Unbelievable.
And because the government helium was so artificially cheap, private natural gas companies around the world had absolutely no financial incentive to invest in the massively expensive cryogenic extraction equipment needed to pull helium out of their own gas wells. They just vented the byproduct into the atmosphere.
Why bother collecting it if you can't make money on it?
Exactly. Why would a company spend hundreds of millions of dollars to build an extraction facility to harvest a gas they can't sell at a profit because the U.S. government is vastly undercutting them? Furthermore, end users like university laboratories and industrial manufacturers didn't bother investing in closed-loop recycling equipment.
Because it was cheaper to just buy new helium.
They treated this precious, finite 4.5 billion-year-old resource as if it were an endlessly disposable commodity.
It's infuriating when you look at the ripple effects in hindsight. So because Congress wanted to balance a specific ledger in 1996, the infrastructure to capture and recycle helium was stunted for a generation. Which is exactly why the cost of operating an MRI scanner for someone listening to this deep dive right now is suddenly skyrocketing.
The consequences took a long time to show up, but here they are.
And this sell-off mandate dragged on, surviving various legislative tweaks and extensions, until we hit the final endgame, January 2024. The General Services Administration, the GSA, opened sealed bids in a public auction to finally permanently rid the federal government of the entire helium system.
The end of an era.
And who bought the remaining assets? In June 2024, a privately held German industrial gas company named Messer officially closed the purchase.
The scale of the acquisition is notable. Messer acquired the entire cliffside field, 23 active natural gas wells, over 38,000 acres of mineral and gas interests, the 423-mile dedicated pipeline that runs from Texas up through Oklahoma and into Kansas, and the remaining 1.8 billion cubic feet of stored crude helium sitting inside the dome.
And the final purchase price for handing over a century-old American strategic reserve to a private, foreign-owned corporation $423 million.
It's a remarkably low figure.
$423 million. For context, that is less than the cost of a single B-2 stealth bomber. We sold the foundation of the entire global technology sector for absolute pennies. And here is where I really need to connect the policy dots, because the contradiction here is so massive it's almost hard to comprehend. We just established that helium is the absolute critical bottleneck for manufacturing modern semiconductors.
We did.
ASML's EUV lithography machines physically cannot carve a microchip without it.
That dependency is absolute.
Well, let's look at what else the United States government was doing during this exact same time frame. In August 2022, the U.S. passed the CSHIOPS and Science Act. The entire geopolitical goal of the CSHIOPS Act was to aggressively subsidize domestic semiconductor manufacturing to escape the single point of failure vulnerability in Taiwan. If conflict broke out over Taiwan, the U.S. wanted to ensure its microchip supply was secure, sovereign, and operating on American soil.
Impartially speaking, the scale of the CSHIOPS investment was historic. The legislation appropriated $52.7 billion in direct federal subsidies for domestic manufacturing.
$52 billion.
This massive injection of public capital acted as a catalyst, triggering an avalanche of private investment. TSMC committed $165 billion to build a massive, sprawling six-fab complex in Phoenix, Arizona.
In the desert.
Intel broke ground on a $20 billion expansion in Ohio and Arizona. Samsung committed to a $37 billion cutting-edge plant in Taylor, Texas. We are talking about hundreds of billions of dollars to onshore chip production, requiring massive logistical feats like pouring thousands of tons of concrete and building pristine clean rooms in the desert.
Wait, let's look at the timeline here. We are subsidizing domestic chip manufacturing with over 50 billion taxpayer dollars, triggering hundreds of billions in private investment to build these massive futuristic factories in the American desert, and during the exact same window of time, we auctioned off the literal keys to those factories.
It's a stark contrast.
We sold the 100-year strategic helium reserve, the precise gas those exact desert fabs absolutely require to operate their EUV machines, for less than $500 million to a private company. We effectively bought the most expensive, highly advanced car in the world and simultaneously sold off the only gas station in town to pay a minor credit card bill.
We put it that way, yeah.
We tried to fix one single point of failure in Tehran by completely blinding ourselves to another one in Texas.
The policy disconnect is indeed striking when you lay the timelines side by side. And to further illustrate the oversight regarding helium's strategic value, in February 2026, just a month before the catastrophic Qatar strikes, the U.S. launched a program called Project Vault.
Project Vault, what's that?
This was a $10 billion critical mineral stockpile initiative designed to secure the vital raw materials for the future economy. It aggressively covers and funds the stockpiling of lithium for EV batteries, gallium for electronics, and cobalt. But shockingly, despite the pleas of scientists and engineers, the initiative completely omits helium.
So the multi-billion-dollar fabs are built, the public subsidies are spent, and 20 months after we finalize the sale of the National Reserve, the Qatar strikes hit.
The timing couldn't be worse.
33% of the world's supply vanishes overnight in March 2026, and spot prices double. Economic think tanks like the Peterson Institute for International Economics are screaming in their reports for the reserve to be rebuilt, but right now the high-tech manufacturing sector is entirely, completely exposed.
It's a very precarious moment.
Which brings us to the final chapter of this deep dive, the desperate scramble. If we're staring down the barrel of a permanent structural deficit, can human innovation outpace geological depletion? What are we actually doing to fix this right now?
The industrial response is happening in three parallel races. The first race is the most traditional approach to a commodity shortage: find more helium in the ground. But the strategy has fundamentally shifted.
Oh, so?
Instead of relying on helium purely as a tiny byproduct of natural gas extraction, exploration companies are aggressively looking for standalone helium reservoirs completely decoupled from hydrocarbons.
Which makes sense, because if the global economy wants to slowly transition away from burning fossil fuels anyway, we can't remain dependent on drilling for massive amounts of methane just to get our tiny fraction of helium.
Exactly.
And the sources point to a couple of massive recent geological discoveries that follow this new strategy.
The most startling data comes from an exploration company called Gold Hydrogen, operating in South Australia. In October 2024, they drilled deep exploratory wells on the York Peninsula. When they analyzed the gas coming up, They recorded air-corrected helium purities of 36.9%.
Stop and look at that number, 36.9%. That is absurdly high. We were talking earlier about how commercial helium is usually painstakingly stripped out of natural gas streams that contain less than 1% helium.
Usually half a percent, yeah.
Finding a geological reservoir that is over a third pure helium is the equivalent of striking a vein of solid pure gold instead of panning for microscopic flakes in a river.
It is potentially the highest concentration ever measured at a commercial wellhead. Additionally, massive geological reserves have recently been identified in the Great Rift Valley of Tanzania. In these active tectonic rift zones, the deep crustal helium generated by radioactive decay has a much more direct, vertical path to migrate upward through the fault lines and accumulate in massive volumes under the local cap rocks.
Okay, looking at the data, discovering a 36.9% purity well in Australia is incredible news, but I have to push back on the timeline here. If they just found this in late 2024, there is no way they have the massive cryogenic infrastructure built out in the Australian outback yet. It takes years to build an LNG-style separation plant. How does an untapped well in Australia help the hospital in Chicago that is running out of MRI coolant next month?
You've identified the critical flaw, the timeline gap. Discovering a high-purity reservoir in Australia or Tanzania is fantastic news for the supply chain of the 2030s. But getting a commercial well drilled, navigating the environmental permits, building the incredibly complex custom cryogenic refining infrastructure on-site in a remote location, and establishing the specialized global export logistics takes years.
Like how many years?
Usually 2 to 3 years at absolute minimum. But the geopolitical deficit from the Qatar strikes is happening right now. The hospitals trying to image cancer patients and the chip fabs trying to print silicon cannot hold their breath for 3 years waiting for the Australian wells to come online.
Which means we have to run the second race simultaneously, using less. We have to fundamentally change our relationship with the gas, stop venting it into the atmosphere like cheap exhaust, and start treating it like the precious, finite commodity it actually is.
Observation is key.
And I was really impressed by the engineering pivoting currently happening in the medical sector to address this. The sources highlight a revolutionary machine from Philips called the Blue Seal Horizon MRI.
This is a perfect example of engineering under extreme economic pressure. Historically, as we discussed, a standard MRI needed an initial fill of 2,000 liters of liquid helium, and because of the thermodynamic boil-off, hospitals constantly had to schedule expensive deliveries to top off their machines with fresh helium.
It's just a constant drain.
The Philips Blue Seal system fundamentally alters that architecture. It is essentially a near helium-free machine. Instead of a massive open bath of liquid, they seal a mere 7 liters of liquid helium inside a highly advanced, fully closed-loop cryocooler system.
7 liters instead of 2,000. And because it's a closed loop, the physics work entirely differently. The helium absorbs the heat from the magnet, boils into a gas, but instead of venting out a pressure valve into the sky, it gets captured by the cryocooler, recondensed back into a liquid state, and cycles through the system again.
It never escapes.
The sources mention that Philips's earlier iterations of these models have already saved more than 6 million liters of liquid helium across their installed global base.
Furthermore, we are seeing a massive shift in the academic sector. Massive research institutions and universities, who historically used to vent their helium exhaust straight out the laboratory window because the gas was so artificially cheap under the old U.S. Reserve pricing, are now rapidly installing their own closed-loop recovery systems.
They're finally recycling.
They meticulously capture the boil-off from their superconducting experiments, run it through their own expensive on-site liquefiers, and use it again. The harsh economic reality of $100 per liter spot prices has finally aligned with the absolute necessity of conservation.
But then there's the third race, and this is where the research transitions from terrestrial geology straight into a science fiction novel.
Oh, this part is wild.
Because if the Earth is running out of helium, and if we are bleeding 50 grams a second into space, where else can we look? How about the sky? The sources indicate we are literally laying the groundwork to mine the moon.
It sounds absurd on its face, but the venture capital, the aerospace engineering, and the binding contracts are already in motion.
Okay, explain this to me.
The focus of lunar mining isn't standard helium-4, which is what we use in MRIs. The focus is a rare, highly prized isotope called helium-3. Helium-3 has one fewer neutron in its nucleus, and it is incredibly valuable for very specific, highly advanced applications, particularly in the cooling systems, for large-scale quantum computing arrays, and for advanced border security radiation detectors.
And the moon is uniquely loaded with this specific isotope.
Relatively speaking, yes. Because the moon has no atmosphere and no protective magnetic field, its surface has been relentlessly bombarded by the raw solar wind for billions of years. The solar wind, blowing out from the sun, is rich in helium-3.
Oh, so it just hits the surface and
When
sticks.
that wind hits the moon, the atoms get implanted directly into the lunar regolith,
Yeah.
the top layer of gray surface dust. A prominent aerospace startup called Interloom recently signed a binding contract with a quantum computing manufacturer named Blue Force.
Blue force, yeah.
The contract outlines an audacious plan to deliver up to 10,000 liters of helium-3 per year, extracted directly from baked lunar dirt, starting in 2028.
I just have to pause and highlight the sheer staggering absurdity and wonder of the modern technological age. We are seriously planning to launch heavy lift rockets, land autonomous industrial mining equipment on the surface of the moon, aggressively sift through and bake the lunar regolith to extract a microscopic isotope, and fly it back through the vacuum of space to Earth.
All for some gas.
All because we accidentally sold off our earthly supply of balloon gas for pennies to balance a spreadsheet and let the rest of it float away. The lengths human civilization will go to maintain our technological momentum to keep the machines running are just staggering.
It highlights a fundamental recurring truth about human civilization. We build incredibly complex, towering, miraculous technological structures, but they inevitably rest on surprisingly narrow, deeply fragile foundations. We implicitly assume the raw materials of the Earth are infinite until the exact moment they aren't.
Let's bring this all together. We have covered an immense amount of ground today, tracing the invisible threads that hold our world together. We started with a burning natural gas plant on the coast of the Persian Gulf, a targeted strike that instantly vaporized a third of the world's supply of a critical element.
Setting off a massive chain reaction.
We zoomed all the way down into the quantum realm, dissecting zero-point motion, the lambda transition, and the ghostly behavior of Bose-Einstein condensates the bizarre, unyielding physics that make helium the only substance capable of cooling our MRI machines and our multi-billion-dollar semiconductor fabs down to near absolute zero.
The physics that run the modern world.
We looked at the agonizingly slow 4.5 billion year process of radioactive decay that actually manufactures this gas deep in the dark of the crust.
We examined the profound, cascading policy failures, how a strategic reserve originally built for military zeppelins was sold off at bargain basement prices, discouraging an entire generation from recycling, and leaving our $500 billion semiconductor investments critically exposed to a sudden foreign supply shock.
And finally, we looked at the frantic global rush to drill deep in the Australian outback, engineer closed-loop medical devices, and quite literally mine the dusty surface of the moon just to keep the lights of the digital age on.
It's an incredible story.
It is a wild, sweeping story. But as we wrap up, I want to leave you, the listener, with a final thought to mull over, something that builds on everything we've dissected today.
To me, the most profound takeaway from the helium crisis is how it forces us to confront our deeply flawed perception of time.
A perception of time.
Yes. As humans, we naturally treat time linearly, and we are incredibly short-sighted in our planning. We plan for the next financial quarter, maybe the next election cycle, perhaps the next decade if we are being visionary. But the vital resources we rely on to power our future operate on massive, incomprehensible geological timescales.
Millions, billions of years.
Think about the helium currently trapped underground. Imagine a candle that took the entire age of the Earth to assemble. From the violent formation of the crust through the long age of the dinosaurs, atom by atom, over 4.5 billion years, this incredibly valuable candle was patiently constructed in the dark.
And then we found it.
And then human industrial civilization came along, we found it, we lit that candle, and we are burning it down to a stub in the span of a single human evening. The helium is burning down, drifting off into the void of space, and we absolutely cannot unburn it.
It really makes you look around your room and your life entirely differently. Think back to that image we started with the kid letting go of the red balloon, watching it float up and disappear into the blue. We are all holding onto strings connected to massive, complex resources we barely understand.
We truly are.
So, as you go about your day today, as you use your smartphone with a processor carved by extreme ultraviolet light buffering through a vacuum, as you pull streaming data down from a hermetically sealed, helium-filled cloud server, as you rely on the invisible scaffolding of the modern world, ask yourself a question. What other invisible geological inheritances are we currently draining? What other billions of years old miracles are we letting slip through our fingers, completely unaware of their true value until the well finally runs dry? Think about it, and we'll catch you on the next deep dive.